Hello and welcome to the Boyce of Reason podcast, or because I don't know how to set up an RSS feed for some reason, this is the Benjamin Boyce YouTube lecture interview circuit. Today's guest is Paul Vander Klay, who is a pastor of the Calvinist Reformed Church, or a Calvinist Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. He also runs a YouTube channel that discourses about Christianity and its intersection with various intellectual currents that are spinning about that intellectual web that we are all finding so sticky that its name is called what it is right now. We're working on that. We're trying to work on that. Here you go.
Hey, Benjamin.
Hey, Mr. Vander Klay.
You can call me Paul.
Hey, Paul. I spoke with somebody who was so polite last night. It was kind of off-putting. He kept on calling me sir. I'm like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, sometimes people call me Reverend Vander Klay, and then I think I'm my father. So,
so you come from a lineage then?
Yeah, both my father and grandfather were CRC pastors.
Oh, right on. Yeah, my dad's a pastor too.
Oh, okay.
Or was. I guess he's just a chaplain now.
Just a chaplain.
So he's just dealing with the end of life, I guess, you know.
That's chaplaincy can be hard work.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's if you're I have a friend who he's an army chaplain and deals with a lot of wreckage in terms of PTSD, families. He's also been a hospital chaplain or a hospice chaplain. I guess he's a hospice chaplain now. So you're constantly walking with people through those last chapters.
Yes.
So
yeah, that brings up a question. We don't need to dive right into the deep end all of a sudden. So maybe I'll reserve the question in a little bit. But yeah, my dad's a pastor, or he was ordained within the Covenant Church, the Swedish Covenant, which is a offshoot of a Lutheran branch.
Yeah,
I believe they're pretty chill folk.
Yeah. The evangelical covenant folks are pretty big into mega church planting. They've got a number of megas here in Sacramento.
Oh, really?
So
okay.
I'm a little bit knowledgeable of them, but I'm dramatically less successable. So.
Oh, and do you enjoy like that working with smaller numbers, or does it would? I'm sure it changes how you communicate when you scale it up. Like every.
Yeah. I've never worked with big numbers, so I don't know. My father pastored small churches. My grandfather did, so It's just kind of been what I've done. So the biggest numbers have been through YouTube lately, and that's been a strange thing.
Why is it strange? I mean, it's pretty fascinating. Like your classroom or your parish all of a sudden becomes the world.
Yes. It's strange because if you're pastoring a local church, a lot of it's face-to-face relationships, and there's time to talk. And so kind of what I've done with this YouTube thing is to try to, as much as possible, maintain face-to-face relationships and have time to talk. But as numbers scale, that's more and more difficult.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you're entering megachurch territory rapidly.
It's the weirdest megachurch anyone could ever imagine, I think.
You're going to have to hire a rock band to open for you.
Get a smoke machine. Some lights. My church is so dramatically un-mega. It would take people by surprise.
How long have you been a pastor?
I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic before I did this, but I've been here at Living Stones for 21 years.
Okay. Oh, wow. One church, 21 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
My father did 36 in his first church, so people say, wow, 21 years. I say, just started. 36 is more than 21.
And what's your flavor It's
Christian Reformed Church of North America. That's Dutch. It's Dutch Calvinist.
Okay. How Calvinist is it? I mean, I can't remember all Calvin, but I know Calvin's the big predetermination, predestination guy, right?
Yeah, that's what he's known for. I'd say I'd say, oh, how could I describe it? Nobody can live like that. Everybody lives as if they're making decisions.
So that's the free will argument, that it's much more compelling to pretend that it's there, even if you don't know if it's there or not.
Yeah, I think, I kind of like it because if you think about it, there's so much of our lives that every decision is so embedded in context that, I always find free will to be a dramatic exaggeration of the power we actually have.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're so embedded in context. So,
yeah.
And we really struggle to have any clear idea about how, say, our agency and God's agency really relate. So I don't know that a lot of pontificating on those kinds of questions really gets us very far.
Well, you don't even have to go to the God-man question. You can just say, I don't know how much agency I have as opposed to my sex drive, or as opposed to my stomach.
That's right. That's right.
So until I master those things, right. I don't know if I have any right to step outside of that.
That's right. Declare my grand autonomy from the forces of the universe. I can't even declare autonomy over my stomach.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the questions about, like, Lent. Is Lent a part of your practice, or a version of that?
The Dutch Calvinists were a little bit stubborn about liturgical calendars.
Okay.
So one of the things that they did was they instilled the Heidelberg Catechism and said, we're just going to do Lord's Day. So you can find some really uptight Dutch Calvinists that don't celebrate anything. In the last 20 years or so, a lot of them have kind of been sneaking back and doing liturgical seasons such as Advent and Lent, and we have at Living Stones, but we haven't stopped eating meat or told people that they should stop drinking during Lent or anything like that.
Yeah,
so,
but I bring that up because the practice of fasting is, at least biblically, it's pretty sound, and it seems to me that one of the purposes of fasting is to really gauge your mastery in relationship to your body, and then parallel that, maybe reflect that to God's mastery over you, or your willingness to surrender to the will of God.
Yeah, precisely. But we have it actually. Early Reformed leaders were known as sausage eaters. While the Roman Catholics were abstaining from meat, they would go ahead and eat sausage publicly as an act of defiance against the tyrannical church, and they exclaimed their freedom in Christ by munching on a sausage in the town square. So
that's taking the whole Protestant thing and turning it into like a pre-internet troll kind of thing.
That's exactly right.
We're going to troll the Baptists with our sausages and mead.
Human nature doesn't change that much.
No, it doesn't. Are you in? Go on.
No, I'd like to know a little bit about you. I've watched some of your videos. I watched you play a game about political correctness or something. Yeah. That's one of the videos I watched that I really, really enjoyed. I thought it was hysterical.
Yeah, I don't know why they made that, but somebody gave them a lot of money to make that. My trajectory into the YouTube thing is that I went to a college in the Pacific Northwest called Evergreen that had a major meltdown.
Yes.
And I was there when it happened, and what happened, there was this big protest, and the library got blockaded, and people got taken hostage. Either, I don't know, you can say they did or did not, but people were rounded up by the students. And the students live streamed the whole thing, berating teachers.
People were rounded up by the students?
Yeah. One of the directors of the protest, I have him on footage saying, I want you to go around and round up all the white teachers that you see. And they're going to be here. And they're going to listen to us now. And everybody's like, okay. And then they went, and I have the police logs too, of them describing how students are stopping cars and searching cars and saying, if you work here, you can't leave, right? So anyways, that got they live streamed that onto Facebook. And as you might imagine, kind of the YouTube community kind of erupted. But nobody was talking about how that actually happened. So I started showing all the different trainings and the seminars and the workshops and the lectures that were putting on this oppressed, systemic racism. Every slight is a sin, privilege kind of politic, and putting that into all the students' minds and kind of trying to show how that was this miniature Chinese revolution was the result of these various intellectual steps that the professors had made for whatever reason. So what got you into YouTube then? What got you into speaking about this? Or maybe even what got you into Peterson and speaking about Peterson?
Well, it was probably during the C16 thing.
Okay.
I had been following Rod Dreer's blog. I had always been sort of on the left side of my conservative denomination because my father's church was back in the 60s. My father's church was in a black community in Paterson, New Jersey, and he came there because the people who had been running kind of a bread and sandwich handout mission wanted it to become a church, and so he became quite involved in the black community. And then as the 60s and 70s rolled on, it was kind of a racial reconciliation church, a church where black folks and white folks worshiped together. So I'd grown up very much in that milieu. So it was a weird combination of African American and Dutch Calvinism, kind of a very strange place. And then I had been a foreign missionary and done that, and then I came to Sacramento, which was one of those churches that grew up in the Christian Reformed Church that also had, a lot of African American folks and folks from lots of different backgrounds, very diverse congregation. But I had been noticing this kind of liberationism for its own sake that had been seeming to get to pick up steam in the denomination. And whereas I had always been kind of on the left of the church, I'd thought, well, there's some other issues down beneath the surface that we should probably have more conversation about, instead of just kind of going off to imagine that this new shape of liberation will somehow bring in some weird political kingdom of heaven on earth. So I'd been reading Rod Dreer's blog for a while, and Jordan Peterson kind of came up in that. And the thing that struck me was, here's a Canadian professor at University of Toronto kvetching about non-binary pronouns, and I had a fair amount of experience with that. My kids went to public schools here, and been trying to work that through myself. And so why is this Canadian professor complaining about these things? And so I started listening to him, and then I'd noticed that he was having biblical lectures. And then I thought, he's some evangelical that somehow wound up at University of Toronto, so I should listen to his biblical. And I started listening to his biblical lectures. Thought, this isn't an evangelical. I'd never quite heard anything like this before. And it really fascinated me. So I started listening to the biblical lectures, and then I started listening to Maps of Meaning and all of that. And was really fascinated, tried to get my head around what he was doing, and then began to notice all of these people were saying things like, wow, I started listening to Jordan Peterson, and I kind of want to go to church. And I thought, well, that's interesting. What's going on with that? So I'd been blogging for years. I'd blogged for a long time, and I'd been blogging about this. And then I thought, and I'd been reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and I thought, there's something about YouTube and Jordan Peterson. There's something about the medium and the message here. So I thought, well, I'll just I'll just make a YouTube video about Peterson just to see what it's like. And I'd been playing around with YouTube, and I'd been doing a little show with a member of my church called the Freddie and Paul Show. And I'd just been playing around with it. I had like 12 subscribers. And so I didn't know what I was doing. I just made a YouTube about Jordan Peterson, and then woke up the next day and I had 100 subscribers. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then I had 1,000 subscribers, and I was very disturbed by this because I didn't want any YouTube mob messing up my life. But then I thought, well, maybe I should make another one. And then people started writing to me, and someone showed up at my church and gave me this poster. And I thought, well, I shouldn't really turn my back on these people. Maybe I'll keep going. And I've kept going. And this is what's happened. So I backed into it.
Yeah. I mean, that's very similar to my own story. I just like started speaking and like, oh God, like I had like little tiny, like 40 little subscribers, and then like I had 1,000, like 10,000. I'm like, okay, this is a real thing now. I gotta do this. There's something that you brought up the other day. You did a long video kind of deconstructing various things. I just kind of been watching it for the last few days, and there's so many different ideas that you're walking through with Peugeot and Peterson and a lot of these different clips and stuff. But one of the things that you say that's pretty cool about Jordan Peterson is that you're watching him change, you're watching him grow, you're watching him formulate in real time. And that's such a novel concept, and I mean that like almost literally. Like the novel is a story that shows the change of a character, classically speaking, or in a certain way of looking at what the novel is. And I just wonder if that's what you think about that, and what does that excite in you to like watch like in real time, like this conversation unfold, this person grapple with things.
Well, I think that's a key aspect, at least of the religious side of his movement. So then I had all these people talking to me and wanting to talk to me, and a friend of mine said, well, you should do a meetup. So, all right, we'll do a meetup. Why not? What could it hurt? Probably no one will show up. And then 12 people show up, and I start to build relationships with these people. And I begin to recognize that Jordan Peterson is like the Truman Show when it comes to this pathway from Sam Harris atheism into we're not quite sure what it's going to be, Christianity. And that's why when Peterson is on Dave Rubin with Ben Shapiro and starts talking about a metaphysical spirit underneath the world, people freak out. And because they're piecing the world together while Jordan's talking, doing his stream of consciousness thing.
Yes. Okay.
And what is that? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's happening, and it's kind of cool. And
yeah. I mean, is that true with how you pastor or how you extrapolate your faith? Is it kind of like a process of grappling with? That's probably even a biblical. There's a metaphor there with Israel. I struggle with God, and that struggle is that somehow like embedded into Christianity, or at least into what you see Christianity as? Absolutely.
I think this is part of the reason why preaching, especially in the Protestant tradition, preaching is such a powerful thing, because in a sense, as pastors work out their faith in fear and trembling, the congregation does too. It's, we're not quite the individuals we think we are. We affect each other in strange ways that we don't understand. And now this is happening with Jordan Peterson and thousands of people.
Yes.
As they wrestle with, well, what does it mean to be a human being? Is there a God? How should I live? What's most important? What's at the top of the hierarchy?
Is that kind of a safety mechanism, like that stance towards a text or towards a belief system of development and discovery and perhaps even invention in certain cases? Is that like somehow guards one from becoming a false prophet or a dictator or somebody who, I know the truth and I will emblazon you with the truth, and everybody is like, we know the truth, we will go forth and prosper the truth kind of thing?
I don't think it's a protection against dictatorships. I do crazy research for my sermons, and I was researching the Cultural Revolution, Mao's Cultural Revolution, and I saw this clip of Chairman Mao, this 70-something-year-old man swimming across the Yangtze and his nation behind him. Yeah. So I'd say actually there's a weakness towards dictatorship and tyranny in this human dynamic more than, but I think this is also a deeply Christian thing, because obviously in Christianity, we're supposed to follow Christ and be like him. Now, obviously, the leader that you're following and who that leader is and what that leader believes will probably be the determinative principle whether or not you will be a tyrant or you live out, let's say, Jesus' life, which Jesus comes and lives, your well-being at my expense all the way to his crucifixion. So it depends on who you're following.
So the dictator or the leader, let's say, to strip kind of like the negative glow off of that, the leader, in a sense, is mirrored by the followers, and the followers kind of take on the shape and even follow to the conclusions, the proposition that the leader is proposing. Everybody.
Happens all the time, happens in every single family. The children watch the parents, and actions speak louder than words, and there's no place that's more true than in the house, in the family.
And how do you guard yourself?
Just how we are.
How do you guard yourself? How do you guard yourself from becoming imprinting on your children or your followers characteristics that will lead them in the wrong direction? Like, how do you do self-inventory?
It always happens. It always happens. It does. We do it all the time, and I have young parents will talk to me, and they want to be the best parent possible, and it's like, well, you will screw up. They are going to take on some of your worst characteristics, but they're also going to take on some of your best. So be the person you want your children to become. That's the best advice I could give you.
And do you see that Jordan Peterson is kind of a leader then, in a way? And what do you and what do you think he's modeling?
Sure.
What are the characteristics that you think are that you're worried about, and that you would like to underscore?
One of the things that caught my attention right away in some of those early videos at Ontario and campuses in Canada was his, at least in some videos, his ability to deal graciously with his adversary and to not just simply devolve down into anger or rage. Now he has slipped up and become angry in the past. I think part of the reason the Kathy Newman interview was so important was that he kept his cool and was able to continue to engage her with a degree of civility, even though many watching it thought she's not being fair. She's not doing as she should. So his skill in that venue, I think, taught a lot of people don't lose yourself, keep a hold of yourself, keep your mind engaged. Don't let anger cloud your judgment and fly off the handle.
And how do you see that he's kind of why do you think he's being a gateway to people entering into the church? Is it specifically because he's talking about the Bible, or is there something even deeper than the content of his speech? Like, is it like the methodology of how he's breaking things apart, or the ideas that he's going towards?
I think he's deconstructing some of the shallow certainties of what really is late 19th century positivism. His conversations with Sam Harris, people kind of listen to it a lot at the food fight level, but just like I don't know if you know who Mr. Plinkett is with the, he does Star Wars deconstruction videos on YouTube. Mr. Plinkett has a great line. He says, "You didn't notice it, but your brain did." And that's what's happening with Peterson all the time. People are beginning to recognize that there's a lot more going on between us than a lot of the cheap certainty that the new atheists were peddling. And so that's why, in many ways, he's raiding their house.
And does that explain the backlash that he's getting? He seems like he's getting a bigger backlash from leftist media than he is the new atheists. So I'm sure there's, I've seen several videos of people like going against him on the religious front or arguing with him on that front. But
no, he's getting a backlash from the left because the left believes they have the program for bringing heaven on earth. And those who don't line up with this program, must be silenced, deplatformed. We'd love to eliminate them, but we don't dare do that, at least yet. So, and that's, his appearance on Bill Maher, I think, was a great example of that, because he paused and said, what are you going to do with the half of the country that voted for Trump? And they didn't have an answer for that because they don't.
Yeah.
And, politically, I've never voted for a Republican presidential candidate. I don't know if I've ever voted for a Republican, period. So, I mean, I grew up a lefty.
Yeah.
But his question, what are you going to do with everyone who voted for Donald Trump? They have no answer.
Yeah. And
again, my master, who's Jesus, says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So, well, that kind of leaves a lot of the normal options for tyrants off the table.
What do you mean by that? It leaves them that option.
You're supposed to pray for your enemies. You're supposed to love them.
Okay.
So that means bigots over here, and that means social justice warriors over there.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to love both sides. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's not easy.
Well, just like that, this is not a Bible verse, but I've heard it a lot around Christianity. You're supposed to, maybe it is a Bible verse. I don't know. You can check me on this. You love the sinner and you hate the sin kind of thing.
No, it's not a Bible verse.
No, that's not. Okay. I was just making sure. Thank you.
Yeah. The relationship between sinner and sin is a lot tougher than we can easily just kind of split it.
Yeah, but is that the same with
love
ideas?
The sinner.
Okay.
What's that?
Is that the same with ideas then? Like you can really dislike an idea and call it dangerous without vilifying the people who
absolutely
accept that.
Yep, absolutely. The difficulty is, and I think Peterson has done well with this too. He had a chapter, I think it was the 3rd chapter in 12 Rules for Life, that deconstructed our do-goodisms. And that was a brutal chapter. And I think it was terribly honest because the video I just did yesterday, I ended with an epilogue that was in Tim Keller's Making Sense of God, where he talks about a guy in a Japanese prison camp in mainland China, and talked about how you put people in an area of deprivation and they get selfish and petty and cynical, and that's how we are.
Yeah.
Now, here's the question. Most of the time, we tell ourselves religious stories and moral stories that try to place ourselves in a better light. That's also how we are. And that's not just true of irreligious people, but also religious people. And then the question is, how can we, in fact, love our enemies when they're really our enemies and they really want to do us harm? Well, here you have the story of a man who prays for his enemies that are crucifying him. Well, how do you live that out?
Well, yeah, how do you live it out without dying out? I mean, that's
right.
Unless something, swoops in, unless you have a deus ex machina come in and give you bread at the final hour once you've given all your bread away.
Which is exactly what doesn't happen on Good Friday. And that's the question of Christianity.
Yeah.
I tell people this and they're like, well, so then, if you listen to Jesus, if you're turning the other cheek and if you're giving your cloak, well, then you get hit twice. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You say, well, then you lose this game of this world. And you say, yeah, that's right. And then people say, well, that's not a strategy for winning. But what's amazing is that Jesus and Christianity are still around.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Why is that?
Now, why is that?
It makes me think of I've been reading a lot of evolutionary biology because I did a lot of work with Brett Weinstein. And there's this thing called game theory. And I believe it's in the book, The Moral Animal, who's the author, I can't remember his name. But he talks about the game theory of if everybody is being generous to everybody else, the system itself will become much stronger than if everybody's cynical. So... Right. It works by displacing your own benefit onto like a higher level. And if everybody starts doing that, or if enough people start doing it, then that culture is going to rise to the surface.
That's right. And think about what true motherhood is. Every mother gives birth to a child at the risk of her life. And that mother continues to empty herself for the sake of the child until the mother dies. That's what real motherhood is. Now, it's beautiful when the child at some point begins to recognize, oh my goodness, this is love. And then how does the child then respond to the mother? How does the good child respond to the mother? Yeah. Well, by giving herself for the mother. And that's exactly that.
Okay.
But you're going to have situations where the child is selfish and the mother still dies.
Yeah.
Which in my take says that's why Christianity doesn't work without the resurrection, because what the resurrection finally says is all of those people who have loved their enemies and paid a price for that with their lives don't finally lose.
But what if we're talking about on a cultural level where you have a growing contingent of very stop-at-nothing people who believe that they can institute heaven on earth? Are you just supposed to lay down your sword and let them corrupt your culture on a massive level? Or do you need to enter the fray on some level?
That's always a tremendously difficult answer. And it's very hard to answer in the abstract, because it always must be answered in the particular. Now, part of Christianity is Romans 13 and the power of the state. And it's the job of the state to actually use the sword for order. And that, in terms of the biblical story, is always countered by the fact that, especially during, say, the Roman Empire, states were dramatically corrupt and incredibly brutal. And so you have the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul say things like, submit to the state, both of whom were killed by that state. And if you think Donald Trump is a lascivious child, you should read histories about Tiberius or Caligula or Commodus. They make Donald Trump look like a Puritan. But it was in this context that Christianity actually flourished. And you'd say, well, why would it flourish? Well, the plague comes to town, and anyone in their right mind would flee the town, except Christians stayed and cared for the dying, often at the cost of their own lives. And then those who actually survived the plague thought about, boy, my family fled town, and these Christians actually stayed and cared for me at the cost of their life. I'd sure like to be like them. And in a weird way, that's how Christianity conquered in a terribly brutal regime. So when you've got, think about the American Civil Rights Movement. Here's the irony of that movement, and why I think a lot of the movements today that try to appropriate the mantle of that movement don't understand that movement, because here you have, legitimately oppressed African Americans who are through and through Christians. They're meeting in church and they're walking on marches and they're saying things like, the only thing you can't make me do is hate you, so I will not hit back. You can turn the dogs on me, you can turn the fire hose on me, but you cannot make me hate you. So go ahead and take my body. And of course, one of the most famous sermons by Dr. King is that evening, I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you. So all of that has built into it Christianity, and I'd say the degree of Christianity that was present in the culture saw that self-sacrifice, and that then moves the hearts of the bigots. Because the question is, what are you going to do with your enemies? Well, if you are an enemy to your enemies, you are not going to change your heart. And all you're going to do is perpetuate the cycle. So what you have to do is love your enemy. And that may mean you may lose your life, you may lose battles, and it may go on for centuries.
But you still actively champion a specific set of ideas. And,
Sure.
and you elaborate them and you put them forward. You don't just bow down to any misinterpretation of those ideas, or do you just allow misinterpretation to flourish?
Sometimes, but most often not. Jesus, so then people get the impression, okay, so what Jesus was a doormat. Well, if you read the Gospels, Jesus isn't a doormat. Yeah. Jesus sometimes says some of the most obnoxious and offensive things. He calls the religious leaders of his people whitewashed tombs. I mean, he says alarming things, but then at the last moment, when they're heaping mockery on him while he's splayed naked on a cross, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. So Jesus clearly had a capacity to, at one moment, be incredibly precise and critical of his adversaries, but at the other moment, it's incredible how he navigates that first century culture war, because everyone expected him to. The centurion comes and says, will you heal my servant? And he does. Well, this ticks off a whole bunch of people, because you're not allowed to heal a centurion's servant. The centurions are the oppressive Roman dictatorship that is oppressing us. And Jesus says, no, I'm going to heal him. And then the religious leaders say, well, don't eat with sinners. Well, who are the sinners? They're tax collectors and prostitutes. Are prostitutes sexual sinners or political sinners? And Jesus says, I'm going to engage with them, and I'm going to talk with them. Tax collectors are Roman collaborators. But Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house and eats with him, even though he's risking ceremonial uncleanness. I mean, Jesus crosses all of these lines, but in all of these strange ways to make his point.
And what's that point? It's a point about humanity, about the nature.
Point about humanity. Yeah. That's right. That, in a sense, what Jesus does is takes this Old Testament tradition that's implicit in the Mosaic Code of Israel being a priesthood, a nation of priests to the rest of the world, and then Jesus acts on that and essentially says Roman centurions are themselves being oppressed by something that the Jews are too. And I have come to declare liberation. So Jesus is a liberationist. But liberation from what? Well, we started off saying that, well, maybe it's liberation. Maybe I need liberation from my own appetites. I definitely do. Maybe I also need liberation from particular religious tyrannies. I definitely do. Maybe I also need liberation from certain political tyrannies. I definitely do. But that liberation must come also with tremendous self-control. And so then Paul comes in and says, you need to be controlled by the Spirit. Well, what does that look like? And what does that mean? Well, that's where we go, and that's what we talk about.
Yeah, okay. So Paul introduces correct me, please. Where Jesus lived the life of Jesus, Paul comes in and he places like another layer, intellectual layer, upon the life of Jesus. He adds to the life of Jesus this rubric of spirit and logos. Well, I guess John did that too.
Yep.
And then where does that lead? And that's what the scaffold of the church starts to build upon and build upon and build upon.
So Jesus is ministering for the most part in the Galilee and Judea with this small element of Jews who are living in their land. Paul is a diaspora Jew, and he comes, and so he's dealing with the Jewish community that I think some estimates have they were about 1/10 of the population of the Roman Empire. They had flourished in the diaspora, and he is dealing with, okay, so it's the craziest story imaginable. So here you have this Jew, and the one people in the world that would never ever say someone could be a God man, because, boy, that would get beaten out of you fast, because of the way polytheism was beaten out of the Hebrew people, basically from the Old Testament prophets on through. So at the end of the story in Matthew, after Jesus is risen, they are worshiping Jesus, and some doubted. So what does Jesus' resurrection mean?
Yeah.
What is Jesus' resurrection? And so Paul, as one of the best educated, brilliant Jewish scholars, diaspora scholars of his day, sees Jesus on the road to Damascus and is like, holy cow, what am I going to do with this? And so he spends 14 years could be in Arabia, just trying to figure this out. So who is this Jesus? Because I saw him, and we have these people who are following it, and it's a terribly messy, dynamic situation. But Paul starts to figure this out, and he starts to gain a following, and he starts to write letters. And of course, generations after, people begin to look back at those letters and say, there's really something about the way Paul was putting this together. And, over decades and centuries, this all then accumulates into a corpus, and on and on.
What would you say the seed of Paul's idea is, or just the essence?
Well, the real question Paul had, so in the time, if you look at the end of the book of Daniel, you get these ideas about resurrection. And so then Paul appears to Jesus, or Jesus appears to Paul on the road to Damascus. He goes back to Jerusalem, and what is this crazy talk about resurrection? So he talks to Peter, and he talks to James, and he begins talking to people who saw Jesus after he had arisen. And because what does it mean theologically that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended? Because at that point, the Jews were anticipating a general resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. What does it mean that Jesus rose in the middle? And that's essentially what he has to work out. And so if Jesus arose in the middle, and if Jesus is the Messiah, what does that do to our theological system and our practices? And what does that do to the wall between Jews and Gentiles, and all of this stuff that Paul had been practicing? So that's what he's trying to work out.
And what's the key that gets him to figure it out? Does he figure it out, or does he just initiate a process of trying to figure it out?
Well, he initiates a process that continues on into the church. It isn't until you start having these church councils that they start formulating these ideas about, Trinity. What is the Trinity? One God, three persons. What is Jesus? Two natures. I mean, all this theological stuff that then gets connected with Greek philosophical categories.
Yeah.
But very early on, I mean, the Apostles' Creed is a very early document, and right away you begin to see God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. All of that is developing.
Is your denomination very visual at all, like the Greek Orthodox or the Catholic Church is?
No, I'm from a tradition of iconoclasts. We were breaking Jonathan Peugeot's masterpieces. So maybe if John and I are friends, that'll heal some of the wounds of the past.
Well, there's nothing like Christians being very unchristian-like to one another to spark history.
That's right. And Christians have been doing that for a very long time, much to our shame.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's just a manifestation of human nature. But I bring that up because I wonder how does your denomination visualize or conceptualize? I guess it's not visualize; it's conceptualize the Trinity as it's almost like a kind of a circuit or a process of the Spirit.
Well, actually, the logo of the Christian Reformed Church in North America is a triangle and a cross put together.
Okay.
So we're a very unvisual denomination, but we at least have that.
Yeah.
But we're the Christian Reformed Church is a creedal church, and so we we subscribe to the main creeds of the church. Calvinism, it's ironic. I'm having a conversation with some other Protestants. Our Calvin was John Calvin a Calvinist? And probably the best answer is no, he wasn't. Well, what on earth do you mean by that? In the early phase of the Reformation there, Calvin and the Reformed tradition called themselves Reformed Catholics because they looked at the Roman Catholic Church at that point and said, there needs to be some correction on some of these things. And some of the corrections involved, a lot of the reformers were pastors, were rather, smart pastors who said the church needs to recalibrate some of these things. And because of also some political things that were going on in Northern Europe at the time, they had the freedom to begin trying to recalibrate things. And that's what a lot of the Protestant Reformation was. But the early conversations didn't go well. And maybe someday we can put the church back together. I think that would be a good thing.
I mean, it seems like historically the church has always been in a process of correction and reformation and protestation and revision constantly. Yes. It seems like potentially with the influence of whatever Dr. Peterson is putting into the recipe, it seems like if there is an influx of people back into the church, it will necessarily have to go through another reformation.
Yes.
Do you see that happening? And how do you see it what needs to be reformed or corrected?
Well, part of why I have stayed on this is I saw very quickly that many of the people who now were becoming interested in Christianity and the church and the Bible were going to have a difficult time finding their way into a church. And I don't mean into sort of the church. I'm into, because to be a Christian is part of, you're part of a local body of believers with all the messiness. It's like someone saying, well, I'm married, but I don't actually have a spouse. I mean, that makes no sense because being married means figuring out how to actually live with someone, which is and to promise you're going to live with that person for the rest of your life. And it's like, boy, that's almost crazy, but that's what being married is. And so I very quickly saw that, boy. So Jordan Peterson followers, they're not going to fit into the main line because of that left wing hit job done on Jordan Peterson. So once you say Jordan Peterson, everyone's like, oh, the alt-right, misogynist, transphobic professor from Canada. So they're not going to fit into the main line. They're going to go into the evangelicals, and you say, oh, Jordan Peterson, the guy that talks about Darwin and Jung. So evangelicals are going to have a problem with him. And so a lot have gone to the Orthodox, and the Orthodox will say, sure, come on in, spend a year or two with us and study catechism, and maybe, or just maybe, we'll let you be a member. And God bless them. Some people have been determined enough to go through that, but a lot of folks are going to be like, I don't know anything about this. So I want to see them be able to find homes in churches.
Mm-hmm. And so it would need to, you're thinking that it would need to either retrofit actual churches that exist now, or just start some sort of pamphlet or process of how to form a church or how to be a part of a church and what does it mean to be in a church.
Yeah, I really don't know. So I've just been holding meetups and we just talk. And I backed into the YouTube thing. I'm probably backing into this thing too. Huh. But part of it is, see, I also think I wouldn't have paid much attention to Jordan Peterson if I didn't think he was offering some light in terms of some longer term issues that Christianity in the West has to deal with. And I think some of those issues have arisen around science and religion. Mm-hmm. One of the difficult things that has been going on in Christianity is that in some ways, if you're reading the book of Genesis, you're reading a story about a flat earth with a bowl on the top of it. And then when you go to school, you're imagining we're on globes circling the sun. And so what that means is people have kind of a split world. And that division of the world happened in the in the fallout of the wars of Reformation that ravaged Europe for a long time. And we've not really put that together. And so Peterson comes along and somehow, through science, convinces atheists that maybe they should think about Jesus at the top of the hierarchy. And it's like, I don't know that we can exactly describe what's happening, but our brain knows it's happening. And it's worth working on.
So it's like the Jordan Peterson's initiating a discussion. This probably happened elsewhere, but he's bringing it to the front of our consciousness, of getting these two parties to turn back towards each other and recognize each other. And instead of being kind of enemies, but to turn around and kind of like embrace in a way.
Well, if Jonathan Peugeot and I can be representatives of the church, I hope so. I don't know how many of us there are out there.
Okay, yeah. But what's one of the big things that needs to happen to make a reconciliation between believers of the Christian God or practitioners of the Christian faith and science, or what you call positivism? And I'm never quite positive what positivism is, but...
So what happens in the 19th century is, with all of this excitement about what we can begin to see ourselves doing with science and technology, we begin to imagine that the world is made up of atoms, and we can put these atoms together. If you look at, say, early atomic theory before a lot of the stuff in the early 20th century, I mean, atoms are these building blocks. And if we can start manipulating atoms with chemistry, we can do all these great things.
Yeah.
And we can build the world. One of the most interesting books I read a couple of years ago was about the Oneida community in upstate New York, written by an ancestor of some of the people there. I mentioned it in some of my videos. It's like, free love and a well-set table, something like that.
Okay.
And that community basically epitomized the height of 19th century optimism about what you can do by joining religion and science together. And in some ways, Brave New World also has some of that, because now we can tear down all the old things, and we're going to practice eugenics, and we're going to practice technology, and we're going to create the perfect society here in our little compound in upstate New York, which was the most Christian area in North America. That was the burned over region. And so, what happens is complete chaos.
Yeah.
Utopia doesn't come. And
I can't imagine.
Well, yes, but it's a fascinating book. And what's amazing is you read that and you begin to see, oh, wow, the kind of stuff we're dealing with now, it's not new.
Yes. Yeah.
It's new to us because we're only 30, 40, 50 years old.
Yeah.
But it's not new.
Yeah.
We live these short little lives and we never study history.
Yeah.
And so we think, oh, my goodness, women are oppressed. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Men have to labor under tyrannies. Yeah.
It's something you keep on bringing up several times now, is this idea of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
What is up with that impulse that we have? Is that a unique thing to our culture? Is that just something embedded in the human animal, the human beast?
Well, don't we want it? Don't we want everything to be good? Don't we want it to be good all the time? So when Sam Harris is talking to Jordan Peterson and he starts talking about, we can calibrate these our little sense of goodness. That's true, because this is better than that. Not stepping on a nail is better than stepping on a nail. And we kind of scale that up.
Yeah.
But I was just working on my Sunday sermon, and so the introduction to my sermon is going to be this lovely little truce that happens the first Christmas of World War I, when they stop fighting for that next Christmas day, and they play soccer and they share food, and we tell this story and we say, isn't it wonderful that if we can only deal with each other as face-to-face people, then we won't have wars. And it's like, have you ever seen a divorce? You ever heard of marriage counseling? We want everything to be good.
Yeah.
Well, why it isn't so simple, because we have these structures. And we say, well, why couldn't World War I have ended with that Christmas Day truce? Well, I don't know that the Belgians on whose farm they're playing soccer would really want to cede to the Germans. And we've got all of these ties all up and down. So, yeah, try heaven on earth. Why don't you be heaven now and see how well that goes for you? Mm-hmm. So it's just rather facile thinking. And what we don't realize is how we really are deep down. And I think Peterson nicely talks about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, both of whom made the point. I mean, Tolstoy, if you've never read Tolstoy's Confession, it's a little book, but it's a powerful little book. And he talks about, as Peterson says, the fact that he had a great career, he had a wife that he loved, he had beautiful children, he had all kinds of money, and he could barely keep himself from hanging himself. What's with us? That we are deeply broken, and we don't really have a clue how to fix ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's how we are.
And how does Christianity come in to the equation at that point? Or is it at that point that Christianity starts to present answers?
I think experientially for a lot of people, it's exactly at that point where Christianity comes into the picture. I was listening to Mark Maron. Mark Maron had a podcast, and I started blogging after this because I got sick of losing references. Mark Maron had a podcast, and Mark Maron, I don't know if you've ever heard his podcast. He's a comedian. He interviews comedians, and he's a funny guy, but he's also a comedian in recovery. So he, like many people, wrecked his life on alcohol and drugs, had to get sober. His take on Christians were, Christians are people who couldn't get sober in any normal way. So they had to do the absolute crazy thing, like, deliver their life up to a higher power. Yeah. And so it's exactly at that point when we recognize how out of control we are that we begin looking for a solution that is beyond ourselves.
Yes.
And so the Christian story, I think, in Petersonian fashion, although I don't think Jordan Peterson quite has the whole Christian story in terms of what he's presenting or packaging currently, the Christian story is that we are in such bad shape, we needed a rescuer to come. But this rescuer has to work on various levels. If you can't save the world without dealing with the individual, and you can't deal with the individual without also dealing with structures. It's always a both and.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so Jesus comes and in that story begins that process. Now, also built into Christianity is the fact that no Christian has the answer. If I tell you, well, I want you to pray, and I want you to fast, and I want you to tithe, and this is how you're supposed to treat the people around you, then the kingdom of heaven will come. No. The kingdom of heaven is always a gift. And what Christianity is living in between two ages. The age of sin and death, or the age of decay, and the age to come. And so if you live in the middle of those ages, which is exactly what Jesus does, you will get what he got. And you say, well, that doesn't sound like a good deal. He got crucified. Yeah, but he also got raised. Well, how do I believe I'll get raised? Well, why did he believe he was going to get raised? There's the challenge. And you might look at that and say, well, I don't want that deal. I'd say, okay, go try another. See how that goes for you.
That living between two ages. I'm sorry. That living between two ages makes me think about what you were talking about in the episode that I watched. And one of the things that you were speaking about was pattern and matter. And that pattern is always governing matter. And what I was thinking while you were talking about that, I'm like, well, what about randomness? What about variation? What about being alive, being aware that I am exerting pattern over matter. I'm on the cusp between matter and that which is not matter, that which is not yet, which could be the spirit in a present sense, or the future in a towards a not present sense yet.
Well, randomness is easy to see. If you roll a die, does that die, when we say, well, I can't what randomness essentially is our inability to predict something more complex than we can think about. That's what randomness really is. It isn't, a true materialist will not say, or should not say, when it comes right down to it, that anything is random. Everything should be the product of the system that's around it. That's what a materialist will say. So on one hand, there is no such thing as random. So then you have the question, well, what kind of world are we living in? Because, so if you listen to, let's say, Matt Dillahunty, I did a bunch of videos about his conversation with Jordan Peterson. Matt Dillahunty will say, well, it's the laws of physics. Well, and then I would ask, first of all, are those laws of physics material? And you say, no. Well, what are the laws of physics? Well, the laws that we discern are patterns. That's what we discern. And so then we notice those patterns and we write them down. But that doesn't answer why those patterns exist as they do. So then the question is, well, where do those patterns come from? So then the question is, well, I was just actually reading a blog today by someone who took this journey from atheism to Christianity, partly because he sat down and read David Bentley Hart and Edward Fesser, who was a Roman Catholic, so an Orthodox and a Roman Catholic, and they were basically saying, no materialist can answer the question of why anything exists. And that's really where theism begins, with that question. So let's imagine Frodo in Middle-earth asking himself why he exists. And so then I ask people, well, if Frodo were going to look for Tolkien, where could he find him?
And Gandalf and himself, probably in Sam a little bit too, and maybe even the orcs, That's right. You will begin to see Tolkien all around you, and this historically has been the answer that Christianity has given. Is that why? Could that why? That even the question why be kind of like just a accident in and of itself? Like we only need why in order to figure out how not to die, right? So that why, we have the capacity for why that outstrips our need for whys once we're comfortable enough to not need to ask why all the time to assess threat, right? So it's a threat assessment tool that is now it has so much excess, so then we retroactively fit all these structures onto the why just to channel that energy, that prompt that's only there for survival.
Well, why? I'm going to use it again. Why would that be true on the small scale and not true on the large scale?
What do you mean?
Well, we know that why is an important question for survival.
Yeah.
And we say, well, maybe that's only important for survival. Well, why would that be true in the small scale and not of the large scale? Why would it not be like a fractal that in fact scales up?
Yeah. So
which is probably why we keep asking it.
Because we are ourselves part of that fractaling.
That's right.
Yeah. And so by I'm just trying to distill what you said. So by scaling up, like there's the why of the immediate moment, and then the why of the day, the why of the week, the why of like what's my next 5-year why, and then what's the why of my life, and then what's the why of those around me, what's the why of the people, my tribe and my state, and then you eventually get to the point where you're asking what's the why of the world.
Right. And if you're a materialist who says, there is no why, well, then that scales all the way back down too. And so, for example,
how does that affect you?
Well, why should I love my child? Why should a mother sacrifice herself for the welfare of the child? Well, that was built into me by my species. Well, Brett Weinstein says, well, why do we have to live out the programming that these tyrannical genes have given us? Yeah. Well, which programming are you not going to live out? So So someone comes to me, again, after I started my videos, and same story. He had been a Christian, and then he gave the whole thing up a lot because of science, and then he had a child, and he began to realize, oh my goodness, what wouldn't I do to protect my child? I can't believe this is just programming. I honestly must think this has to scale up. There needs to be a real reason why I love my daughter that's bigger than just, well, this is just my programming. That there's some truly good thing about sacrificing my life and my well-being, maybe not dramatically, but every day. What a good parent does is every day they sacrifice their life for their child. And we say, that's good. And just like you said, well, all that generosity scales up and up and up, and we all benefit from it.
And so, in a way, to believe in God, or to postulate a primal cause or an answer to the why that you cannot know, but that allows you to merge yourself or to let go of the smaller difficulties that would cling to you. I guess in a way, like the weight of the world, not necessarily sin as in mistake, but the weight of the world is able to be offered up to a greater will. Or
yes.
But how do you slip in, not slip into like a facile, like this happened to be because God said that this would happen to me, and not turn around and clean up your room? How do you prevent yourself from not like actually taking care of yourself if you completely surrender everything up to the great why?
Well, just about every one of my sermons, I end with misery, deliverance, gratitude. So misery is the reality of this world, which is not only is the problem of the world my enemy, the other guy, but the problem is in here. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. Solzhenitsyn, that's right. Deliverance. God saw what a mess we were, and through total generosity, sent his son to become our victim, and didn't intervene. Okay, so there's the deliverance. Now gratitude. Think about Saving Private Ryan. These soldiers, battle all the way through D-Day and find Private Ryan. His brothers are dead, and they've lost a bunch of their buddies on this insane mission to save him because someone up in Washington doesn't want bad PR. And Tom Hanks looks at Matt Damon and says, "Earn it." And Matt Damon could have said, "Lucky me, you idiots just battled through Europe." But something in our heart says we're moved by the heroism of what has happened. And so then in the Gospels, the centurion looks up at Jesus dying and says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." We're moved by that. We're moved by that display of generosity and self-giving. And then when we see something that beautiful, we say, that's what I want to be like. And every kid that has a noble father, and that's me. My father was a noble man. He poured his life out for the forgotten people of Peterson, New Jersey. And, on one hand, as a little boy, I'd look at him and say, gosh, what an idiot. I remember there was once that we had this rope that we were playing with as a kid. It was a rope. Okay. It's just a rope. And my father is outside doing something, and some kids come up and ask him for a rope, and they say, "We'll bring it back." And my father had no guile and said, "Sure." And he gives him the rope. And I go out and I'm like, they're not going to bring it back. You just gave away my rope. And I'm ticked off. But now later I realized, he probably shouldn't have given away the rope. But what he did for these people was so noble and so beautiful. At some point you begin to say, what am I going to live my life for? And this is what happens with every mother. I don't have it up anymore, but a friend of mine, very successful man, grew up, poor black kid in Watts in LA, and his mother kept him out of the gangs, made sure he was in school, put him through high school. She did this by cleaning other people's houses and being a janitor. And I'll tell you, when that woman died, he threw her the best funeral you could imagine. He had senators and mayors, and why? Because he knew what it cost her for him to be what he is.
Yeah.
That's what why live any other way? It's beautiful, it's glorious, it's heroic, it's gorgeous. There's the gospel. There's why we don't say, Jesus died for my sins, I'm going to sin more. No, because it's beautiful and I want to be like that.
And when you do sin, you're corroding that great society that is afforded you as much as you've been afforded without realizing it, insofar as you're taking it as granted, everything that you have right now.
I'm squandering Tom Hanks' sacrifice to save me from certain death on D-Day. Why? That's hellish in and of itself. You see, it's all built in all the way out, which is, well, every time I sin, I'm inviting a little bit of hell into me. It's that selfishness. It's the one who looks at his kid and says, yeah, I probably should play a game with you, but I'm just going to be self-indulgent. It's the mother that looks at the child and sees, oh, my daughter's got it better than me. I hate her for it. So I'm going to be the kind of mother that nobody wants. So there's just a little bit of hell. And again, Peterson gets this right too. It all fractals out.
Yes.
Heaven and hell. And that doesn't discount the reality of it at extremes, because extreme realities exist too. But it just says that it's all connected.
So taking that into account, that gratitude, taking also into account humility, that you can't know everything. I think you were bringing this up in the episode the other day. Yep. We just can't. We're unable to see everything. We have to distill it down into cartoonish symbols. So taking those two things, gratitude, humility, and yet still the desire to change the world, then how do you go forth and change the world? How do you become an activist in the world and not fall into the trap of that heaven on earth dystopia?
Right now with the Patreon thing, I was looking at all this stuff this morning, and I was just torn by it, because I'm very much a non-activist. Yeah. And again, I think another thing that Peterson gets very right is clean your room. Do you want to change the world? Raise your children right. Is there anything harder than that? Probably not. Do you want to change the world? Start in your little place. This is why I'm a small church pastor. And, I've got ambitious fantasies just like anyone else. But one of the things that I realized, by watching my father and how he pastored was, love these forgotten people in the first ward of Peterson. And that's enough. You're just a human being. Just do the right thing. Start there. The world is too big for you. And that's, again, part of the reason I love Tolkien is that, you've got Gandalf and you've got Aragorn, but who actually saves the world? Well, it's Frodo. And in fact, he almost does it unintentionally. I mean, it's virtually an accident that causes finally the destruction of the ring. Yeah. And that's how we are. So, and again, I think Peterson is right when he says, you're 19 and you're all filled with these ideas that you've gotten from your professor, and go out and do this. And I was that way as 19 too. Oh, I'm gonna change the world, and then you realize I'm an idiot. I can't even, like you said, I can't even get my stomach to obey me. Yeah. So why don't I begin right here?
Yeah. I like you brought up another thing that you brought up is that we all want to be gods, and we continually find that we're horrible gods, and I don't mean to be flippant, but one of the things that we all can do is die. Like, that's something we can do no matter what. So Jesus is modeling a kind of God that we all can do.
That's right. I've never thought of that before, but that's really, I'm going to use that. It'll appear. And so if I don't see, Peterson says pastors are liars. We're also thieves. So you just gave me something. Where'd you get that from? I got that from Benjamin Boyce. He gave that to me. We all want to be gods. And Jesus says, you want to be a god? Here, I'll show you what gods do.
Yeah.
The real God, every king asks young men to die for him. The real God dies for the young men.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful. This has been a wonderful conversation because, like, I think you kind of like forced us to couch it into ourselves and like what we do and making it realistic. And one of the traps of entering into a philosophical debate or a theological, adventure is that you're talking about all these ideas that are very nebulous. And Peterson's really good, and it's art. What he does is art. It's a rhetorical. He's at the pinnacle of the rhetorical game. But how do we make that real to real people? How do we give a place for people to take ideas and like interact with each other through the ideas? And the ideas can melt away, and hopefully they're good enough ideas that they can keep on propagating that communion. And it seems like we might be on the cusp of, or we're probably always been on a cusp, but this is just another form of us breaking the bread of all these ideas, but doing it in a buttery manner, I guess.
That's good. I think that's true. And that's why, people will sometimes say, well, you're my pastor. And it's like, yeah, but you're always a Christian at the local level. You're always a Christian face to face. And that's probably where you're a crappy Christian most, because and that's what people are like, well, I went to that church and they were like hypocrites and they were selfish and they didn't know how to behave and they were playing games. And it's like, yeah, that's what's in church. Those are the people you'll find. Well, I don't want to be around them. I want to be around perfect people. Yeah, you want to marry perfect people too. And then you're married. So then you think, oh, I found the perfect person and we got married and it's wonderful. I say, yeah, wait a few years. But they'll think you're not so perfect after a while. But that's where the real work begins.
Yeah.
And that's because that's where I begin. That's where I have to start to recognize, no, I'm the selfish idiot.
Yeah. Okay.
And I can't even manage me, never mind the world.
Yeah. So a rejection of the imperfect puts you on a crash course towards being unable to even live in your own skin. You start rebelling against the imperfect in the hopes that the perfect will arise, but you always have to snap it back down to, I can move this a little further towards perfection, but perfection itself is just a direction. It's not a state that I'm ever going to find.
I'm not going to get there. And then if you realize that we are formed beings, well, then I begin to realize, yeah, my parents, I had wonderful parents, but they weren't perfect. And so some of their crap got built into me. Mm-hmm. So I've got that crap to deal with. Then I've got the crap in the subculture I grew up with, or the Christian tradition I grew up in, or the political tradition I grew up in. I mean, it's just all a mess, and I can't even see straight. And that's really where faith and grace come in, because, yeah, I might be really disciplined about being the best person I can be, and that's where the irony then is that strength turns into tyranny. So that's where I have to live by faith, because I've got all these ideas of what perfection is. Yeah, you give me enough power and you give me enough license, I'll become a tyrant. So that's where I have to say, okay, I'm probably going to get a lot wrong. This is what I think, but I'm going to even have to hold that loosely. But and I'm not going to dominate you or be a tyrant.
Yeah. Not to ask, this is a question I loathe, but it bears asking, because we did bring up the why, and then there's the why of suffering, like the why of imperfection. Like, why would something that is perfect deign that there be an imperfect world? Like, what is being proved here? What is being tested or experimented with through imperfection?
Yeah, I have no idea. But one of the interesting things about the problem of evil is that doesn't get raised until about the 17th, 18th century, which is a really fascinating historical tidbit. Because we look at it today and say, well, that's the most obvious question in the world. And it was asked by a variety of people. Church fathers dealt with it a little bit and came up with some answers. But basically the assertion that I can't believe in a God because of the suffering in the world really didn't rise. Probably we see it after the Lisbon earthquake, fire, and tsunami. It was a terrible tragedy in Europe. So there's something there connected with the Enlightenment where we began to think that we could, in fact, perfect the world. So those things seem to be connected, but we don't know why. The usual answer was given by Job's wife in the book of Job, where Job's life falls apart and Job's wife says, curse God and die. Or the answer given by Odysseus, which is, I'm going to be crafty enough to set the gods against each other and outfox them. It's only much later that we began to say, I can't believe in a God because the world is messed up. The ironic thing about that answer, though, is, okay, then what's your plan? And that's where you get into utopias, because people say, oh, I have a plan to make the world perfect. And I say, oh, really?
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have a perfect life?
Yeah. That's a good kind of a breakdown of that progressive thinking. Like, again, it's that kind of like a Christian or even pre-Christian story about this rebelliousness, this rebelling against something, rebelling against the obvious, rebelling against limitation. It could even be a very righteous rebellion, a rebellion against evil. Like, how much more righteous can you get?
Yeah.
But something sneaks in, something's caught in the blind side of your searing hatred for the evil that then launches you on a path of amplifying everything evil inside of you, or even everything just minorly imperfect becomes evil because it's then magnified.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, thanks for your time, Paul.
This was fun. And like I said, I enjoy your channel. I watched the video you put up today. I hope it stays up.
We'll see.
It was hard to watch, but I thought important.
Okay, see, I was thinking about that when you were talking about like turning the other cheek, and I was playing some Art of War stuff there. I'm like, this needs to be talked about. And there's the whole thing, like, I could be risking something, but there's the other thing, like, that I've tried to practice in entering into, like, the critical discourse. Like, how do I be humane to the person? How do I not dehumanize? Because that is exactly the last thing I want happening to people. So it was just, I don't know, I'm sure I didn't walk that tightrope correctly, but...
Well, this is where people get so flippant today. Well, my religion is love. Well, do you know how hard it is to love a human being? Well, maybe when they're a baby. Well, you know why it's sort of easy to love a baby, unless it's in the middle of the night. It's sort of easy to love a baby because the baby isn't capable of much power.
Yeah.
Well, and so what does it mean? So for about 5 years, I literally had a homeless man who lived outside my door. I couldn't open my door without stepping over him. And so then I had to live with this question. What does it mean to love this person who is a drug addict and an alcoholic, and he's got mental illness, and it's tremendously hard to love another human being, especially because there's lots of us. So it's so difficult to deal with those questions. And like you said, it sometimes feels easier to do it in the abstract, but that's not the kind of love we need to do. So
no, go on.
No, go ahead.
Well, especially in this current world, in the digital landscape, it's very easy to just completely dehumanize the other person. Like, I can do as much as I want against this person because they're not really real, or they're really small, or they're really far away, or, like I'll never touch them because there's billions and billions of people. But the problem with that is that scales, like you were saying, the fractal starts to grow. And then what we end up doing is entering into and propagating a pessimistic society, a nihilistic society that then begs for a tyrant reformer or some sort of Christ or somebody just coming in and pulling the plug, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. None of us are going to get out of this alive, Benjamin.
No. But we can all be dying gods in our own small way. What was your solution to the man on the door? Was it just a daily solution? And
I lived a lot of daily solutions. He eventually attacked a member of the church.
Okay.
And because he would garbage pick, he brought all kinds of garbage here. And when I was around, I managed it. But when I went on vacation, I wasn't here. Yeah. And I'm about 6'4", 230 pounds. He never attacked me. Yeah. But he attacked an 80-year-old man. He didn't attack him badly, cut up his hand. But neighbors saw it, called it. I mean, we tried to get the police involved for years, but it's a complicated business. But at that point, he crossed the line, spent a year in jail, and now there's a restraining order. He hasn't shown up. He just got out of jail a couple months ago. He hasn't shown up yet. He probably will, and the saga will continue. But, you know, I consider the man my friend, and I very much want good for him, but he wasn't an easy man to love. People would, you know, he'd get ticked off at me if I threw away a bunch of his stuff because it became a health hazard. And then he'd be out there screaming threats against my life. And people are like, he just threatened to kill you. I said, yeah, he does that all the time. But, you know, but, you know, okay, so there's an example that we look at and say, oh, but life is full of such examples. Maybe not quite so stark, but, you know, parents and children that don't get along, husbands and wives that don't get along, neighbors that don't get along, nations that don't get along. You know, these things do scale. And so work on them. You know, you want to be a Christian? Well, try loving the people that you share your home with. What does it mean to love them? It's a good place to start. It's really hard. And it doesn't mean always being a doormat, because sometimes love means saying no. Parents know that. Yeah. Yeah. And God knows that. Yeah.
Walk softly and carry a big cross, I guess, would be
That's good too. See, I'm getting lots of good stuff from you today.
Well, yeah. Follow me on Twitter. Like, there's things that are both for and not for church.